Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Research Sofa. I'm here today with Hayley Trowbridge from People's Voice Media, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what they do. So hiya Hayley, and welcome to today's sofa. Could you tell me a little bit about People's Voice Media and what it is you do?
Yes, of course. Thank you for inviting me for this conversation as well. So I'm part of the team at People's Voice Media, and we're essentially a social change charity. And our core kind of thing, what we do is bring people's voices together, so that through dialogue, people can create their own solutions to any issues within their worlds. And we work predominantly with lived experience. So we have a methodology that we call community reporting, which is about people using devices like this, phones, tablets, any kind of portable tech kit, and now in the age of Corona, Zoom and other platforms, to have conversations with each other and record digital stories. And the idea is that the stories are always led by the storyteller. So they set the agenda, and the community reporter is there to facilitate a conversation. I guess a little bit like what we're doing in this episode. And with those stories, we look back through them with the storytellers and the community reporters to curate them into insights and learnings that can be kind of mobilised for change. So we work in co-production settings, we work in policy, research and evaluation, community development, all of those buzzwords. But essentially all we're doing is, I guess, using experiential knowledge, so the University of Life, if you may call it, and bringing that knowledge to the forefront to help people effect change around them in different ways.
Yeah, so that all sounds really good. And earlier you were telling me a bit about a particular project you've been doing with creative minds. And could you tell me us a little bit more about that and what that project involved and what you did and how you worked together?
Yes, absolutely. So Creative Minds are a charity over in Yorkshire, who an NHS charity over in Yorkshire, and they are big advocates and deliverers of creative activities to support wellbeing. And we met them as we kind of stumble across people on different paths at different events, and got chatting about what we did, and they were like, "Oh, that sounds like an interesting way that we could demonstrate the value of what we do," because there's this term, the soft and fluffy, which is the project title, soft and fluffy, and the idea is, how do you evaluate that soft and fluffy stuff? So how do you evaluate those feelings, or the way that, engaging in art, on creating, making, whether that's painting or whether that's creativity through sport, or whatever it is, how do you measure that? Because it's kind of like a feeling and it's not very tangible. And they found that some of the evaluation tools they were using, like, how did you feel about this, or was this good, this improve your well-being or your mental health, them kind of, them skills and all the rest of it, they weren't quite capturing it. Like, they were all positive, but it didn't actually speak the what people were actually feeling. So we joined a project with them, and the University of Huddersfield, where we tested out how community reporting, how peer-to-peer storytelling of people involved in these creative activities who also might have been struggling with their well-being or mental health, and tried to use storytelling as a way of capturing what that impact of that creativity or that creative activity was. So we trained up groups of community reporters, and they told their stories, and then they went out to different creative projects like the Arts Cafe and the Good Mood Football League, and gathered other people's stories about those activities and what it meant to them in a very loose way. So they didn't go out with like a questionnaire or anything they were going to ask, like, how good does this make you feel? Because then you're just directing people. It's more like, so what's the Art Cafe like for you? And then a conversation would just happen. And from that, what we did what we would call story curation or sense making, where we watched them back with the community reporters and picked out the key findings and grouped them. And our colleagues at the University of Huddersfield at that stage took them and produced a very, like an academic piece of writing, a report, what kind of picked out some of those learnings. And I guess so some of the learnings from that project, were about actually people valued being with other people was a core part of it. People would rather, I guess, not have a mental health illness, whether it was depression or psychosis or anything else in that broad spectrum. Um, Not necessarily just have it seen as the whole thing that defines them, and instead to be seen as a whole person who has other active interests and have other things going on, and to see how, if those areas were strengthened, what would happen. So not necessarily saying that people do not need medication, but saying that medication is not the only answer. So one of the stories that's always sticks out in my mind is one of the footballers who said, "Pass me a football over a tablet any day. That will make me better." And then one of the community reporters themselves were talking about how through blogging and storytelling, she's overcome quite severe mental health illness, and that's a core part of who she is, and it's helped her on that recovery. Um, so yeah, it was a really interesting project, and then once we got the findings, we held a conversation of change event with the University of Huddersfield, what brought together some of the storytellers, the stories, and also healthcare workers and health and social care professionals to look at what we learned and to kind of look at how practice and how mindsets might change. So rather than, I guess like a prescription model of, oh, this is what drugs you need, actually think more in, I guess, the potentially the social prescribing world. Although I guess that sounds still a little bit medical, but that was the idea, to show people that, I guess, maybe if people were doubting what the impact of these community or creative activities were, that they could hear directly, how life saving, as many people said, it saved their life, not the medication, through art or through, going to an artist studio, and to see that that mattered, and also to see that it mattered for those people not to be seen as a patient but as a person. So a lot of people were talking about how at the Good Mood Football League, they're all footballers, whether they have mental health issues, whether they've overcome mental health issues, whether they're part of the kind of coaching team or the organisers. Everyone there was like a footballer or a football fan, and that was how they were seen. And at the art studio, one of the projects, people were talking about it was important to be seen as an artist and have a studio space, and that was what they were. They weren't a mental health service user; they were an artist, and this this was like kind of what was underneath all of why it was working. So it wasn't just that someone gave someone a paint by numbers to do. It was about how they were received and perceived in that space, as opposed to um, being pigeonholed in I guess a deficit model base. It was actually, oh, here are some of my assets, here are some of my skills, here's other parts of me, and it were being seen. So it was a really interesting project, and with Creative Minds, and others within the Yorkshire area, we've continued doing this, but looking at other health inequalities now across there, and expanded using it as an evaluation or a research tool, because I guess because it's accessible and inclusive, and people themselves get to set the agenda rather than the researchers. And I think that was a key part of the project. There was the addressing of old and new power throughout it. So if we see the old power as being the medical model and the traditional medical institution thinking is we're here to fix you, and if we see academia as being we are here to research you and find out, this project kind of toppled that over and said, okay, so what are the solutions and what will make people feel better without the medical professionals telling them what it is. And the research model was, we don't have any questions, we don't have any hypothesis that we want to prove, we just want to listen and make sense of this with you. So the people who were being researched were the researchers, as opposed to someone like myself coming in, gathering data, analysing it, and then telling people what we think of them. It was people gathered the data themselves, people made sense of it, and then people spoke about those findings were. So I think it was definitely that different way of thinking and shifting that power in both fields, in terms of research and in terms of healthcare.
Well, thanks for telling us about that project. That's really fascinating, really just so interesting to hear about these different ways of doing things and flipping research on its head and trying different things and trying to understand the world and people in different ways. So it's been really lovely to have you on the sofa today. I'm really glad you can join us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.